Welcome to Part 5 of Herbert Has Been Murdered. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks. And be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 21. 51 A.M. A Woman's Slipper. Lieutenant Williams felt a jolt of realization, his eyes sharpening with keen alertness. If what he was hearing was correct, and Mrs. Franklin had indeed not taken the sedative prepared for her by Dr. Jameson, then the possible paths this situation could take were many and quite troubling. "How do you know this, Miss Smithers?" he inquired. "Because when the nurse went downstairs to make that coffee, I approached the bed. I needed a closer look at Mrs. Franklin. You know that feeling when you're drawn to examine something you loathe? That's the curiosity born from hate, I suppose. I touched the blanket at the edge to lean down, and it was damp. Something had been spilled on it. The only thing that could have been spilled was the sedative. She had regained consciousness, you see, when the nurse and Dr. Jameson brought her in from here and laid her down. But wouldn't the doctor or the nurse have noticed her pouring it out? We didn't see it, Lieutenant, because just after the doctor handed her the glass, she said, 'There's blood on that dresser.' Naturally, we all turned to look at the dresser. Of course, there was no blood on it. The doctor assumed she was delirious. She was just finishing her drink when we turned back." "Didn't you confront her when you felt that damp spot on the blanket?" "What good would that have done? She would never have admitted it. I truly believe," Smithers replied fiercely, "that I could have pricked her with pins, and she would endure it rather than confess. Then I felt a sudden fear, not so much of her, but of what she might do to Mr. Franklin. She was up to something, and I didn't know what her motive was. I ran upstairs, grabbed my gun, and came right back." "She was still in bed?" "Yes, but the shooting was over, and the room felt cold." "The room was cold," Smithers said, her voice sharp as she pressed her points forward. "And her skin was cold, her breathing heavy from her recent efforts. I think I was about to kill her. I would have killed her if the nurse hadn't walked in at that moment." "Why didn't you tell anyone this right away, Miss Smithers?" "Would you have? Would anyone?" "I'm not sure I follow. There had just been that shooting, and I had a gun. I wanted to get rid of it. By the time I got rid of it, it was too late. I couldn't say anything then without practically accusing myself of a murder I didn't commit." "So you'll stay here in the house, Miss Smithers?" "Of course, since I'm going to be accused of killing Mr. Franklin." "Not yet, Miss Smithers." "It doesn't matter to me." She turned toward the door, adding bitterly, "You'll find me an obedient prisoner." "One moment, please, Miss Smithers. How long were you away from Mrs. Franklin's room when you went upstairs to get the gun?" "Just long enough to run up and back. I really don't know." "Where is your room?" "On the upper floor, the room on the left side of the hallway at the front of the house." "And where did you keep the gun?" "In my trunk, where it is now." "Was the trunk locked?" "Yes, I keep it locked." "And the keys?" "In a purse. The purse was in a drawer of the dresser." "That gives us a pretty good idea of how long you must have been gone, doesn't it?" "I suppose, probably 3 or 4 minutes. Closer to 5 or 6, I'd think. But we don't need the exact number. What we need to compare is 2 different actions within the same time frame. While you were going through the various steps you described, would Mrs. Franklin have had time to get out of bed, grab a revolver, open a window, and shoot Mr. Franklin from the balcony? "Franklin, will you be back in your room and tucked into bed by the time you come down? I believe so, don't you?" "There would have been more than enough time for that." "You've been in the company of Mrs. Franklin for quite a while. Have you ever noticed if she has a pistol?" "I can't say that I have. No, I'm quite sure I've never seen one. That doesn't mean much, though. There are plenty of hidden places where she could have kept it. It's also possible." Smithers spoke with a desperate intensity, trying to shore up her accusation rather than merely proposing a theory. "That someone could have recently given her a revolver, wouldn't you agree?" "Anything is possible. Mr. Hollander, for instance." "An excellent example." He remained silent, and soon the air grew thick with unspoken tension. Smithers had run out of patience. "Is that it?" she asked, her tone flat. "I believe so, Miss Smithers. Except I would like to know why, given your recent insinuations regarding Mrs. Franklin and Hollander, you suggested he was the right person to stay with her husband tonight. Isn't that a bit contradictory?" "Quite. Then why did you do it?" "I have no more to say." Lieutenant Williams abruptly moved to the door and opened it. Christian and Hanson were nearby in the corridor. "Hanson," he instructed, "accompany Miss Smithers to her room. There's a gun in her trunk. She will hand it over to you. Keep it safe for me." "Yes, sir." Smithers stepped outside. "Am I to consider myself under arrest, Lieutenant?" "No, Miss Smithers, but as I've mentioned, you cannot leave the house. Christian, come inside with me." Christian entered and closed the door behind him. He watched as Lieutenant Williams lifted the sheet over Franklin's face once again. "What's Dr. Jameson doing, Christian?" "He's gone back to bed, sir. Should I fetch him?" Christian shot a wary glance at the bed. "No, let him rest. There's nothing pressing at this moment." "I'll need to see him in about 15 minutes, he said. Lieutenant Williams stepped into the bathroom, opened the window, and stepped out onto the balcony. The sky was a dim grey before dawn, and the air was unusually clear and fresh. Below, the garden was vividly outlined. Other gardens belonged to the neighbouring houses, as well as those at the back. It was a street filled with gardens that, Williams mused, bloomed solely for the caretakers during summer, while their owners escaped to fashionable resorts in the mountains or by the sea. Williams took a moment to shine his flashlight on the window of Franklin's room, which had been raised from the bottom just when the shot was fired. The light revealed a clean surface. There were no marks to suggest anyone had pressed their nose or forehead against the glass. The stone sill showed no telltale threads of silk or any other clues indicating a woman's presence. He gazed thoughtfully at the windows of the room above, where the oddly vindictive Mrs. Quammen was likely either resting or engaging in her blank-eyed routine of mental curses. No, he could not picture her lowering herself to the balcony with a rope or ladder. A century ago, she might have crafted a wax figure resembling Mr. Franklin, and through some incantation, stuck pins in it to achieve her aims. But those simple methods had no place in this modern, skeptical age. It would be essential to question her further about the vague and bitter hints she had thrown about Franklin's outrageous behavior toward the maids. Even the city could not stifle the fresh, fair breezes of dawn. He stared at the fading stars and wondered if Smithers's extraordinary statement was nothing but a lie. After all, it all revolved around nothing more significant than a damp patch at the edge of a spread, and Smithers could have easily spilled something there herself to support her story. Was she truly as clever as he suspected? From what he had gathered about her, he certainly believed she was. He would need to consult with Dr. Jameson, of course, before taking any serious action. The doctor would likely make a fuss, especially since he had just gone to bed and would need to be dragged out of it again. Well, late-night disturbances were part of the job for doctors and police. They were expected to be on call at all hours, just like heat or water. He moved slowly toward the windows of Mrs. Franklin's room, carefully examining the balcony and sills with his flashlight as he went. There were no smudges, no threads, no indications until he reached the last window in the row. There, on the balcony floor just beneath the window, something glimmered in the beam of his torch, a bright jade green. It was a woman's slipper. Chapter 22. 14 a.m. Tap, tap, tap. Lieutenant Williams picked up the slipper with a heavy sigh. It was an uncomfortably obvious clue, but it led to a conclusion he was reluctant to accept, one that conflicted with how he believed matters should unfold. On the surface, the case appeared to be straightforward. Hollander had arrived at the house at 7 to prevent Mrs. Franklin from committing murder or suicide, shocking Mr. Franklin nearly to the brink of death. And just a little while ago, Mrs. Franklin had shot her husband to stop him from making a statement that could incriminate Hollander. Nonsense. Lieutenant Williams outright refused to buy it. Still, it was undeniable that Hollander had intended to stab Franklin with that knife, The evidence was clear. Moreover, Hollander's motivations were transparent and uncomplicated. He wanted to protect Mrs. Franklin. But what about her motives, and Smithers's? At the core of this puzzling mystery lingered a burning question. What had sparked the search through Franklin's pockets and the papers in the upper left drawer of his desk? Yet there was no point in lingering outside on the balcony, admiring the dawn's glowing sky and savoring the morning air as if he were some kind of connoisseur. Lieutenant Williams returned through the bathroom window to Franklin's room. "The night's almost over, Lieutenant," Christian greeted him. "Almost over, Christian. And it's been one hell of a night, if you don't mind my saying so." "I don't mind." "Especially for him." Christian gestured with a strong thumb toward the bed. "Least of all for him, Christian. He may be better off, in a way." "He is. There's a lot of beautiful nonsense written about how people kill the things they love. Maybe in a philosophical sense, but with a bullet, Christian. That's a different story." "I don't follow you, Lieutenant." "That's not surprising, Christian. Truth be told, I'm not sure I even follow myself." Lieutenant Williams walked to the door and opened it. Hanson stood outside, holding a gun wrapped in a clean handkerchief. "Smithers's gun, Hanson." "Yes, Lieutenant. It was exactly where you said it would be, in the trunk. I wrapped it in a handkerchief so it wouldn't disturb any prints you might want on it." "Right, Hanson. Go upstairs now and wake Dr. Jameson. Ask him to come down here immediately." "Yes, Lieutenant." Hanson paused for a moment. "What's the matter, Hanson?" "I understood you correctly, didn't I, sir?" Hanson said uneasily, "when you said that maid wasn't to be arrested." "Yes, I don't want to take any action regarding her for now. We might charge her later for a violation of the Sullivan Law, or we might not." "Yes, sir." Lieutenant Williams took the gun and went back into the room, closing the door behind him. He carefully unfolded enough of the handkerchief to expose the barrel. He sniffed it and concluded that the gun had neither been fired recently nor cleaned. It carried the distinct smell of something that had not been used or maintained in a long time. At that moment, he was inclined to believe that Smithers's account was correct. "Is that the piece that did the damage, Lieutenant?" Christian asked, interested in the examination. "No, it isn't, Christian. This gun hasn't been fired in years." "Well, I wish it were. I'd like to get out of this place." "Still feeling uneasy, Christian?" "No, I'm not nervous, Lieutenant. I'm just uncomfortable. It feels like there's something about this case that hasn't been resolved yet. You know what I mean? Something we haven't even touched on." Lieutenant Williams understood exactly what Christian meant. He felt that same unsettling sense of an approaching something tied to an unknown danger. It was an instinct, however, that needed to be stifled. After all, having overly sensitive patrolmen wasn't seen as beneficial to the department. One really shouldn't be allowed to step into the realm of the psychic, unless they've earned the rank of lieutenant. Putting aside your weekly escapades between the pages of a book, this is your first real murder case, isn't it, Christian? "Thank goodness it is, sir." "Well, you'll get used to them eventually. By the time you handle your fourth or fifth case, you'll have moved past these feelings of dread." "Will they likely be similar to this one, sir?" "That depends entirely, Christian, on how much coverage this particular case receives in the newspapers, as well as the number of potential victims who have fragile hearts. I imagine the method will become quite the trend for a time." Just then, there was an irritable knock on the door. "Ah, come in, Doctor." Dr. Jameson entered, just as irritable as his knock. The camel's hair dressing gown wrapped around him hinted at the muscles within that twitched beneath its loose fabric. His hair looked tousled and unkempt. "Honestly, Lieutenant," he began, "this is becoming quite a farce." "I apologize, Doctor, but I needed to speak with you immediately about Mrs. Franklin's condition." Dr. Jameson's expression dimmed slightly at that. "Nothing happened to her, has it?" "No, Doctor, nothing at all, and I sincerely hope I don't have to deal with another murder right now. It's about her general health. Is her heart in good shape? Dr. Jameson's interest began to overshadow his annoyance. Absolutely sound. Why do you ask? I want to conduct an experiment on her. You want a what, sir? Dr. Jameson nearly yelled, now fully alert. Please, keep your voice down, doctor. I need you to allow me to be alone in the room with your patient. You can open the bathroom door just a crack and watch me from there, but I need the nurse out of the room. And I need you to stay silent while you observe. I don't want Mrs. Franklin to know you're present. Dr. Jameson shot a sharp look at Lieutenant Williams. This is absurd. She couldn't possibly know who was there and who wasn't. She was unconscious. Maybe she isn't, Doctor. That's what her maid just told me. Lieutenant Williams presented Dr. Jameson Smithers with his surprising theory about the spilled narcotic, and Dr. Jameson was, understandably, taken aback. So you see, it's a possibility, and the fact that I found that slipper outside the window makes it seem like a certainty. It's the most astounding thing I've ever heard. If you don't mean to shock her, Lieutenant, I'm willing to go along with whatever you propose. I won't do anything rough, Doctor, like firing a gun near her ear, pinching her, or slapping her, or any of those tricks people think policemen have up their sleeves. You can stop me at any point if you have objections to what I'm doing. Have you figured out exactly what you'll do? With a woman like Mrs. Franklin, there's no point in planning every detail. All I can do ahead of time is set the stage, and then decide what to do in the moment when the time is right. It won't be complicated. What kind of atmosphere are you going to create, Lieutenant? Well, first, I'll call the nurse into the hallway, and you can tell her not to return until I say so. You might suggest that she go down to the kitchen and make some coffee. She seems a bit fixated on coffee, or something. Then we'll leave Mrs. Franklin alone in her room for a minute or two. If she's really faking, she'll start to worry about what's happening. Then, when the door opens again, it'll be me coming in instead of the nurse. She'll likely suspect that I found the slipper, but she'll be even more careful to maintain her act of being in a narcotic haze. Jameson nodded and turned his attention back to the room. The air was thick with tension, and he sensed that they were on the brink of something significant. Lieutenant Williams adjusted his stance, glancing around to ensure everything was in place. Let's hope Mrs. Franklin stays settled for a while longer, he said quietly. We need her to be in the right frame of mind for what's coming. Agreed, Dr. Jameson replied, his eyes narrowing. The longer we can keep her unaware, the better. Just then they heard a soft rustle from inside the room. They held their breath, both men aware that even the smallest sound could disrupt their plan. Are you ready? Williams asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ready, Jameson confirmed, tension coiling in his gut. Let's proceed. With a gesture, he indicated to the lieutenant to ease open the bathroom door. As he did, the hinges creaked slightly, and both men froze, hearts racing. Once inside, they moved as quietly as possible, knowing that their careful orchestration depended on remaining unseen and unheard. They positioned themselves behind the door, peering out into the main room where Mrs. Franklin rested. The sight of her slumbering form was both a relief and a fresh source of anxiety. Would she awaken soon? Would she notice anything unusual? Remember, Williams instructed, we have to be patient. Jameson nodded, his focus unwavering. All they needed was for Mrs. Franklin to remain unaware just a little longer. Jameson felt just like one of those remarkable characters he had read about in Fenimore Cooper as a child when he stepped back into Franklin's room. Lieutenant Williams took a full minute before he opened the door and entered. He avoided looking at Mrs. Franklin and instead quietly moved to a chair, lifted it, and placed it right next to the bed. He pulled the slipper from his pocket and sat down. A complete silence settled in. For 3 minutes, he checked his wristwatch. He remained still and stared at the closed eyelids of Mrs. Franklin. Then he began to tap the slipper softly but persistently, maintaining a steady rhythm as it struck the arm of the chair. Tap, 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 tap. Mrs. Franklin's face kept the smooth, serene stillness of sleep. Tap, tap, tap. Her breathing was deep and even, a testament to her slumber. Tap, 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 tap. "If you keep that up much longer," she said softly, "I might just go mad." Chapter 23. 2:29 a.m. A turn of the screw. "You don't have to say anything you don't want to, Mrs. Franklin." "I'm glad you didn't use the usual script, Lieutenant. It would have disappointed me if you had. Could you please get me a cigarette? There are some over there on the dresser." Lieutenant Williams stood up, fetched the cigarettes, and lit one for Mrs. Franklin and one for himself. "You really shouldn't have left your slipper outside the window," he remarked. "You shouldn't have found it." Now that her eyes were open, they were remarkably guarded, and her fingers held the cigarette without a hint of nervousness. "The slipper isn't the main issue, Mrs. Franklin. There are many other things at play, you know." "Is this your way of scattering clues everywhere? I never pictured you as someone overly concerned with clues. You're more interested in people, reading their minds." Her gaze offered a nearly audacious challenge for him to decipher hers. "Who were you aiming at when you fired, Mrs. Franklin? Your husband or Mr. Hollander?" Mrs. Franklin elaborately exhaled smoke rings. "Neither, Lieutenant. I didn't even have a gun." "So it was just out of curiosity." "What was?" "Why you went out on the balcony." "I didn't go out on the balcony. I've never set foot on it in my life." "I'm not naive, Mrs. Franklin." "Nor very gullible, either." "No, not gullible." That's the trouble with the truth. It often sounds absurd. "Surely you understand how things appear to be against you, Mrs. Franklin." "Very bleak. The worst part is that you didn't take the narcotic, and then acted as if you were unconscious." Her expression turned innocent to an almost bewildering degree. "Is it illegal to choose not to take medicine, Lieutenant?" His respect for her as a rival grew substantially. "No, Mrs. Franklin, but in this situation it was intentionally misleading. Really, I just didn't want to hurt Dr. Jameson's feelings, that was all." Lieutenant Williams envisioned her sustaining that demeanor, elegantly dressed in simple black, appearing innocent and strikingly beautiful, before the 12 impressionable and typically dull folks one encounters on juries. He was reluctantly aware that she might just get away with it. "And it's not illegal to go to sleep, is it?" she continued. Lieutenant Williams realized that to make any progress in this interview, he would need to tighten the screws a bit. "No, Mrs. Franklin, sleep isn't illegal. Even," he added casually, "if your husband has just been killed and well, whatever you want to call your relationship with Mr. Hollander, let's just say your friend is gravely injured." The cigarette fell from her fingers to the floor. Lieutenant Williams ground it out with the sole of his shoe. "I don't believe you." Her voice was as pale as her skin. "You must have noticed for yourself, Mrs. Franklin, that he was seriously hurt when he collapsed. There was enough blood around, goodness knows." "You're trying to trap me." "Just stating the facts, Mrs. Franklin. Of course, it's possible you left the moment after you fired and didn't see Mr. Hollander go down at the hands of the police. You're being shockingly cruel. You were certainly in such a frantic rush that you dropped your slipper and didn't bother to pick it up. Did you throw the gun into the garden, Mrs. Franklin? It's only a matter of time before we find it." "Is Mr. Hollander still in the house?" "No." "Where did they take him?" "To the hospital." "Please call for my maid and leave the room. I need to see him immediately." "I'm sorry. Will you please leave this room?" "You don't seem to understand, Mrs. Franklin. You are under arrest." The realization hit her like a thunderclap. Her head fell back against the pillows as if it had been thrown there. "But that's absurd. Absurd, I tell you. You said it yourself, Mrs. Franklin, that the truth is often absurd. You're seriously accusing me of murdering my husband." "Arrest may have been a poor choice of words. For now, I'm holding you as a key witness, Mrs. Franklin." "Mrs. Franklin, had recovered some of her composure. "I won't indulge in tears or bribery, Lieutenant. I'm not naive enough to think that anything would sway you from your responsibilities. However, I would like to appeal to your sense of reason. You'll find me to be a sympathetic listener, Mrs. Franklin. My unfortunate pride compels me to add that I shall also be an astute one. You see, I had a good idea of what was happening from overhearing the nurse and Smithers talking. Lieutenant, what exactly do you want me to confess?" "That you were on the balcony." "But I was." "Then how did your slipper end up there?" "It fell off my foot." Lieutenant Williams stood up suddenly. "You must excuse me, Mrs. Franklin," he said, "while I search this room." "You misinterpret my words. I mean exactly what I say. I wasn't on the balcony, and the slipper indeed fell from my foot. If you must know, I was perched on the window sill." "What stopped you from going outside, Mrs. Franklin?" "The sound of the shooting. It rattled me. I nearly fell back inside and shut the window. I knew I had dropped a slipper outside, but the thought of doing anything more than scurrying back to bed terrified me." Lieutenant Williams examined the slipper in his hand. "This is a left-foot slipper," he noted. "Therefore, when you were perched on the window, that foot would have been outside. Wouldn't you agree?" "That's rather basic logic, isn't it?" "Indeed, but it confirms that at the moment the shots rang out, you could look along the balcony toward your husband's window. Did you?" "I suppose so. I can't say for sure, though. It was completely dark out there." "On the contrary, there was a faint light from the furthest window, which was slightly open, wasn't it?" "Perhaps. Yes, I think there was." "And did you see anyone standing at that window when the shots were fired?" "You mean on the balcony?" "Yes." "No." "That will be all, Mrs. Franklin." "You don't believe me?" "To be honest, I don't." Franklin's expression stiffened noticeably. Whether it stemmed from bitterness or a sudden internal resolve was hard to tell. "Does being held as a material witness prevent me from getting out of bed and getting dressed?" she asked. "Not at all. In fact, it's necessary that you do. You see, we keep our material witnesses in jail." Once again, he heard the soft echo of brass bells in her voice, just as he had the night before. "If you would leave me now, please." "Just as soon as I've searched the room." "For what?" "For a revolver, Mrs. Franklin." Mrs. Franklin closed her eyes and turned to face the wall. Lieutenant Williams conducted his search with the thoroughness and efficiency of someone well practiced. He looked around the room, in the cupboard, through the drawers, and beneath the furniture. There was no gun to be found. He took a dressing gown and laid it on the bed. "Please put this on, Mrs. Franklin. I need to search the bed." She complied without a word or protest. She walked to the window and gazed blankly at the dawn breaking outside. Lieutenant Williams pulled back the bedspread and used a pencil to mark the damp spot where the narcotic had spilled. Then he folded the spread and tucked it under his arm. The mattress, pillows, and other bedding revealed nothing. He walked toward the door. "I can send your maid in to you, Mrs. Franklin, if you'd like." She kept staring out the window, turning her back to him. She didn't respond. He tried to interpret her stance. It wasn't a petty act of rudeness or sheer anger, nor did it suggest despair or fear. As he stepped outside and closed the door, he was struck by the unsettling thought that, despite how ridiculous it seemed, her posture conveyed a distinct sense of uplift. Chapter 24. 41 a.m. As the colors of dawn. "Well," Lieutenant Williams said, as he entered Franklin's room to join Dr. Jameson, "what do you think now?" Dr. Jameson had shed his confusion. Even wrapped in his camel's hair robe, he had regained a considerable measure of his dignity. "Lieutenant," he replied, "I believe my services are no longer needed here. With your approval, I plan to send away the 2 nurses and go home." "Of course, Doctor, if that's your wish. The prosecuting attorney will likely want your testimony to secure an indictment and will need you at the trial, but I'm certain he'll minimize any inconvenience for you. We understand how disruptive court matters can be for a doctor. I will gladly testify when needed. Could you also provide me the contact information for the 2 nurses? Their statements will be necessary as well. Dr. Jameson gave the name and address of the nurses' home, where Miss Vickers and Miss Murrow could be reached, and Lieutenant Williams jotted it down in his notebook. Would it trouble you much, Lieutenant, to inform Mrs. Franklin that I have left when you see her? Not at all, Doctor. I doubt she will need my services again. He lingered in the doorway for a moment. That woman, sir, is made of iron. I wouldn't be surprised, Doctor. She certainly seems well fortified. I'll send Christian with you to take you, and the nurses past O'Brien at the door. No one is allowed to leave the house without permission, you see. Thank you, Lieutenant. Goodbye. Goodbye, Doctor, and thanks for all your help. Christian, come back after you've seen the doctor out and stay in the corridor. I'll call for you when I need you. Yes, sir. The door closed, leaving Lieutenant Williams alone. A persistent feeling of lurking danger crept out at him from the stillness of the room, growing increasingly unsettling. His nerves were usually as steady as the firmest rock, but today they were jittery, making him feel as if his goat were getting away from him. He moved to the chair in front of the flat-topped desk and settled in. The drawer filled with disorganized papers needed sorting. He took the drawer out, and with a quick tilt, emptied its contents onto the desk. Among the tangled mess of bills and receipts, he was surprised to find a good number of letters from women. He read each one carefully, and by the end of each, found himself feeling increasingly concerned about the future of humanity, not so much due to threats to its morals, but rather its intelligence. He grouped the letters by sender, creating small stacks. One pile stood out with 10 letters, all signed Bebert, and addressed embarrassingly the same way. My caveman. Franklin, he decided, must have been quite the fool, as well as a rather low creature. It was all well and good for Smithers to rave on about soldiers, pure hearts, war, and such. But that was all it was, raving. So what if Franklin, and presumably her brother, had innocent hearts? Guinea pigs had innocent hearts too. Lieutenant Williams found himself questioning the sanity of everyone involved in this case, wondering if he was the only one slightly mad. Smithers, Mrs. Franklin, the housekeeper, Hollander, Madame Suarez, they all seemed a bit off, which struck him as a sign of madness when one viewed everyone else as insane. Yet he had never encountered anyone truly normal in troubling times. The letters were utterly useless as clues to a motive, just a sticky mess of desire, greed, dullness, and terrible taste. He pushed them aside and watched as the morning light strengthened, streaming through the window across his desk. The sky he looked upon was a deep emerald, while the backs of the houses across the gardens were a blend of mauve and dark grey, with thin stripes of lemon yellow tracing their roofs. Bohème filled his thoughts. Dawn always reminded him of Bohème, and he softly hummed a few notes. Then his mind turned to Mrs. Franklin, and her image took on the soft, blended colours of the morning, a woman defined by subtle shades and intricate layers. It became clear to him that she could never have killed her husband. Or Hollander, for that matter. In truth, he believed she was incapable of taking anyone's life. This conviction solidified in him, even in light of the considerable evidence stacked against her. He mentally reviewed her case as a prosecuting attorney might lay it out for a jury. Right from the beginning, there was the telling fact that she had called the police. Why would she do that? Based only on a hastily scribbled note that could or couldn't be a threat, and a gut feeling that her husband was in danger. The prosecution would likely make clever remarks about premonitions, fortune-telling, and the ace of spades. They would argue that those who committed crimes likely to be uncovered soon, sometimes, contacted the police to create a false sense of innocence. There were her clear admissions of wanting to kill her husband, how she had left her room right after he knocked and said goodbye, and her questionable actions concerning narcotics and her time on the balcony. Motive. The prosecutor could list countless reasons. The most apparent would be her jealous anger over her husband's well-known affairs and her own significant feelings toward Hollander. Yes, the prosecutor could very well secure a conviction against Mrs. Franklin and involve Hollander as an accomplice, but he would need to find the weapon to close the case. Lieutenant Williams had overlooked that detail. He stood up, approached the door, and swung it open. Hansen was waiting outside, having stationed himself there until Christian returned from escorting Dr. Jameson and the nurses. "Hansen," Lieutenant Williams said, "I need you to search the backyard for a revolver that might have been discarded from the balcony. If you can't find it, check the 2 neighboring backyards, as well as the 3 behind. Don't wake anyone in the other houses. Just grab a stepladder and cross over the party walls." "Yes, sir." "Report back to me as soon as you're done, or if you find anything." "Yes, sir." Lieutenant Williams closed the door again. The revolver would seal the case, Mrs. Franklin as the mastermind, and Hollander as the accomplice. What a messy situation it would be, too. There were so many angles to it. Hollander and Franklin as the ultimate brothers in arms during the war, turned by the cruel whims of a temptress into rivals. Or would Mrs. Franklin headline the tabloids as a woman scorned who took her rightful revenge under the pretense of the unwritten law? If her lawyers were sharp, she certainly would, and they would be clever without a doubt. She'd likely have the most formidable legal team available on her side. It wasn't just the gun that Lieutenant Williams was after. There was something else. Franklin's hat, that was it. How did the person found in the cupboard relate to Franklin's hat? The answer struck him with sudden clarity, like a light illuminating a puzzle his subconscious had been mulling over. The hat was the final piece of the person's disguise. And the implication of that pointed to a woman. A man's hat would significantly enhance any disguise a woman might adopt. But which woman? And why had his hat ended up in the cupboard? Yet the puzzling question of what had driven the search through Franklin's pockets and papers remained unanswered. There was, of course, a straightforward and logical explanation. The item or document, whatever it was, had likely been discovered and taken by the thief along with Franklin's hat and the top button from his overcoat. If that were the case, the true nature of that item might remain a mystery forever. For the 4th time since he had settled at the desk, Lieutenant Williams inhaled deeply. There was a faint scent, strangely familiar yet almost elusive, that he was certain he had encountered somewhere else during the night. It only became noticeable when he was seated at the desk, leading him to conclude, with little effort, that it must come from something connected to the desk itself. Perhaps it was from that opening where he had pulled the drawer. Suddenly, the telephone rang sharply, cutting through his thoughts. He reached for the device, sliding it closer across the surface of the desk, and lifted the receiver. The voice on the other end informed him that the call was from Central Office. Chapter 25. 1:01 a.m. Lunatic Vistas. The call Lieutenant Williams received from Central Office had one piece of useful information. The person who had used Franklin's comb and brushes was a blonde, either a man or a woman with barbed hair. As he hung up the receiver, Lieutenant Williams thought about Mrs. Franklin, who had her hair cut in a blonde barb. Aside from the haircut, Hollander had similar characteristics. Smithers, however, did not. Where was his earlier confidence in Mrs. Franklin's innocence now? Exactly where it had been before. His thoughts began to spiral. What was that strange scent lingering in the air? And what about Hollander's roommate, the young Southerner who targeted wealthy women in nightclubs? Did Franklin have evidence connecting Hollander to similar activities? Had Hollander come to either steal that evidence or silence Franklin? Rats! What were Nancy Norwich's address and phone number doing in Mrs. Franklin's personal directory? And why had Mrs. Franklin lied so foolishly, claiming not to have seen anyone on the balcony when the shot that killed Franklin could only have come from there? A knock sounded at the door. "Come in," he called. Christian entered. "There's a woman downstairs, Lieutenant. She insisted on seeing you." "Did she say who she is, Christian?" "She did, and believe it or not, her name is Molasses." Lieutenant Williams felt his scattered thoughts reassemble just a bit. "Please, Christian, show Mrs. Molasses in." Madame Suarez, under the sharp morning light, was a sight to behold. The hours since Lieutenant Williams had last seen her, wigless and muttering to herself in her stepdaughter's apartment, had clearly been filled with worry. As she stepped into the room, Lieutenant Williams signaled to Christian to wait outside and shut the corridor door. Over her black sequined dress, She had draped a cascading evening cape of blue satin trimmed with marabou, and a stylish hat adorned with feathers perched on her wig. Her gaze barely registered the details of Franklin's room or the figure beneath the sheet. All her attention was on Lieutenant Williams, the man she had come to see. "Nancy is dead," she declared, her voice still carrying the strangled quality that suggested a scream. Lieutenant Williams wearily closed his eyes. Another murder would indeed break him, a burden he was already too weary to carry. "Please sit down, Madame Suarez," he urged, gesturing for her to take a seat. "Tell me what happened." Madame Suarez settled into an armchair, the blue satin and marabou spilling around her like clouds. "I don't know how it happened," she admitted. "Did you find her body in the apartment?" "There's no body." Her sharp little eyes glinted with an odd certainty as she added, "He got rid of it." "Who did, Madame Suarez?" "Herbert Franklin," she replied. For a brief moment, Lieutenant Williams's mind raced with possibilities. Had Franklin killed Nancy Norwich, perhaps right after she sent that note to her mother? He swiftly shook off the thought. It was absolute nonsense. Franklin had been in this room while Nancy was writing that note, and he was in the process of being killed himself. "That's impossible, Madame Suarez," he said calmly. "Franklin was attacked right here around the time your stepdaughter must have been writing that note to you. That was at 7 last evening, the exact moment he was supposed to call on her at her apartment. It must have been shortly after 7 when she wrote, as she mentioned in the note that he hadn't arrived." "Doesn't matter." She waved her bejeweled fingers dramatically. "I'm certain he did it, and I want him caught and punished." "But Mr. Franklin is dead, Madame Suarez." "That's what you say." Was he really going mad? Lieutenant Williams wondered. There were so many troubling possibilities swirling around every bizarre detail of the woman's story. Who had actually identified Franklin? His wife did, but only indirectly. His friend Hollander, again by implication. Smithers had seen the dead man's face, but she, like everyone else, had lost her mind. And Dr. Jameson, what proof was there that Dr. Jameson was who he claimed to be, or that the phone number given by Mrs. Franklin belonged to him? It could all have been orchestrated by some clever group. "This is madness," he said abruptly, mostly trying to convince himself rather than the small, intense face staring back at him from the armchair. What he needed was sleep, just a couple of hours of deep rest. "Madame Suarez, the body on the bed is Herbert Franklin. Now, please tell me clearly why you believe that Nancy is dead." Her beady eyes sparkled with anger. "I believe she killed herself to spite me." The knotted paste jewels on her bony fingers trembled with indignation. "She did it to make me suffer," she added, "to deny me." "Just so she wouldn't have to give you any more money," he suggested. Madame Suarez started to sob loudly. "What will I do, Lieutenant? Oh, what will I do?" He continued to watch her, with half-closed eyes. "Can't you find someone else to take her place?" he asked. "Someone else to blackmail?" "I'm not young anymore. It's too late for that." "Come now, Madame Suarez." "No, it's true. And for something like Nancy's situation, you need to have the right looks. But surely an intelligent and charming woman like you, Madame Suarez," he laid it on thick, "a savvy woman of the world, can think of other cases where the evidence could be fabricated. You know, deep down, that you never had any real or visible proof that Nancy killed her husband in that canoe accident, do you?" "I did have proof, Lieutenant." "Nonsense." "If you truly had it, you'd carry it with you and show it to me," she said. She coyly nibbled at the bait, but still refused. "I do not, and I have not. And," she continued, "I insist on proof of that woman's death. I'll find it, even if I must search the river myself." Madame Suarez sprang up, her nerves fraying as she hurried to the door. "So you witnessed her drown, Madame Suarez?" "I saw nothing, but I know what must have happened." She dashed into the corridor, racing towards the stairs, a vision in blue velvet. Lieutenant Williams pursued her, only to find Christian blocking her path. "Call for the wagon, Christian. and have her detained as a material witness. Madame Suarez erupted in fury. "Don't you dare touch me. Keep your filthy hands off me." "Take her downstairs, Christian. Once you've arranged for the wagon, leave her with O'Brien. Then go up to the housekeeper's room and ask Mrs. Quammen to come down. I'll meet with her in Franklin's room." "Yes, sir." Lieutenant Williams retraced his steps slowly. When he returned to Franklin's room and closed the door, a strong sense of looming danger washed over him again, more intense than before. He shivered slightly, as if a cold draught had snuck in, and quickly glanced at the windows, which were both firmly shut.